Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Union Journalism, and tonight I have some terrifying news for you. For a brief moment, the world came to a standstill, not because of a missile launch, not because of a formal declaration of war, but because Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin suddenly appeared at the center of a global shock that few saw coming. This story has fundamentally shifted the ground beneath our feet, a story that leaders in Washington, Moscow, and capitals around the world are scrambling to understand. A moment that did not play out on a battlefield with thousands of soldiers, but unfolded in the blink of an eye during a raid few anticipated. A raid that has now triggered reactions many feared had been buried for decades. Before we begin, wherever you are watching or listening from, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe to the channel. We kick off tonight with a major move that leaders in Washington long worried about, quietly brushed aside, and never truly prepared for. A decision that did not drag on through endless talks, but hit all at once in a single day. One day that rocked diplomatic channels across Europe. One day that forced military strategists inside the Pentagon to hunt for new plans. One day that could reshape how global power itself is understood. What happened in Venezuela today went too far for the people in the Kremlin. Once that boundary was crossed, officials fired back with anger, shock, and visible panic. But the deeper issue is simpler than it looks and far more dangerous. It might not matter anymore, because Russia has effectively shut the door on diplomacy in a way this world has not seen since the height of the Cold War. Once again, the world came to a standstill tonight, not because of a missile lighting up the sky, not because of a formal declaration of war read from a podium, but because Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin suddenly found themselves at the center of a global shock that has rewritten the rules of engagement. Nicolás Maduro, the longtime leader of Venezuela, a man who defied American sanctions and survived years of coup attempts, was captured in an operation that unfolded quietly and then exploded across global headlines. What followed was not celebration. It was not clarity. What followed was confusion, a heavy silence, and then something far more dangerous. A warning from Russian President Vladimir Putin directed not at the current administration in the White House, not at the Pentagon, but squarely at Donald Trump. At first glance, the event looked regional, just another chapter in Latin American instability, another strongman removed from the board, another shift in the politics of the Western Hemisphere. But within hours, the framing changed completely. Putin began treating Maduro's capture not as a local event, not as a Venezuelan issue, but as a global precedent. And in that precedent, he placed Donald Trump at the very center. From Russia's point of view, this was never about Maduro as a person. Moscow has no deep loyalty to the man himself. This was about what his capture represented. The idea that a sovereign leader could be snatched up, removed, and neutralized by external forces. And to Vladimir Putin, the face of that aggressive, rule-breaking style of American power is not the traditional political establishment. It is Donald Trump. Russian state media and senior figures did not mince words. The message was blunt, heavy, and terrifyingly specific. If world leaders can be captured, if they can be removed or neutralized with external involvement, then no leader is truly safe. And if that logic is allowed to stand, if it becomes the new normal, then global restraint begins to collapse. That is where Trump fully enters the story. Putin did not simply threaten Washington in abstract terms. He threatened Trump personally. He bypassed traditional diplomatic channels entirely to send a signal to the man who represents the most aggressive form of American foreign policy. He targeted Trump's past rhetoric, his style of power, and his willingness to break norms and test limits. In Russia's narrative, Trump is not just a political figure. He is a symbol of unpredictability, a symbol of pressure politics. He represents a world where force replaces diplomacy and outcomes are imposed rather than negotiated. And once that framing took hold inside the Kremlin, the language escalated rapidly. We are no longer talking about diplomatic protests. We are not talking about ambassadors being summoned. We are talking about nuclear deterrence being openly mentioned, not as an immediate threat to launch, but as a reminder, a signal, a line drawn in public. This is the kind of language nations use when they want the other side to understand that this is no longer theoretical. This is existential. What made the moment especially tense, what caused the air in diplomatic circles to turn cold, was the timing. Trump remains the dominant figure in American political consciousness and on the global stage. Any action connected to his name carries future weight. Russia is not responding only to what happened in Venezuela today. It is responding to what might come next. From Russia's perspective, allowing the Maduro episode to pass quietly would normalize something dangerous. It would normalize the idea that leadership removal, even indirectly, is now an acceptable tool in the great power game. That is a world Russia does not want to live in. That is a world that threatens the stability of the Kremlin itself. And so the message was sent early, and it was sent loudly. This is not about defending Maduro. This is about protecting a principle that shields power structures everywhere, including Russia's own. Because once the rule breaks for one leader, it weakens protection for all. Trump, intentionally or not, has become the face of that break. What complicates matters further is Trump's own history. He has openly challenged traditional alliances, he has questioned NATO, he has praised strength over process, and he has repeatedly signaled that old rules no longer apply if they stand in the way of American outcomes. To Putin, that makes Trump both dangerous and unpredictable, a man who does not just pressure rivals, but reshapes the rules they rely on for survival. This is why the reaction was not subtle. It was not delayed for days of analysis, it was immediate. Because in international politics, silence is sometimes read as permission. If Russia stayed quiet, it would look like they had accepted this new reality, and Putin is determined to show that he accepts nothing of the sort. The United States, meanwhile, has been cautious in its public language. Officials have avoided direct escalation. But the silence surrounding Trump's role has only amplified speculation. When clarity disappears, narratives rush in to fill the gap. And right now, Russia is writing its own narrative at full speed. In that narrative, Trump is the stress test. He is the figure who determines whether global norms still matter or whether raw power has replaced restraint, whether leaders can still trust that certain lines will not be crossed. This is not how crises usually begin. There were no dramatic fleet confrontations in open waters, no images of tanks crossing borders, just a single event that quietly shifted assumptions and forced major powers to rethink their red lines. The real danger is not immediate conflict. It is miscalculation. When countries begin treating individual political figures as strategic threats, tensions become personal very quickly. Decisions stop being about policy and start becoming about signals, pride, and deterrence. That is where the risk lies tonight. Trump may not have personally piloted a helicopter. He may not have been the one kicking down a door in Caracas. But his name, his legacy, and his political gravity have transformed this moment into something far larger than Venezuela. This is no longer about Maduro's fall. It is about the world that comes after. A world where leaders feel exposed, a world where nuclear language returns to everyday diplomacy, a world where power is tested openly, not quietly behind closed doors. And at the center of that shift, whether he intended it or not, stands Donald Trump. To understand why this specific event triggered such a massive and disproportionate response from Moscow, you have to understand the psychology of the Kremlin. For decades, the unwritten rule of the Cold War and post-Cold War era was simple. You fight proxy wars, you fund opposition groups, you impose sanctions, but you do not touch the leader. The leader is the state. If you decapitate the state, you invite chaos that cannot be controlled. That rule helped keep the peace between nuclear powers for nearly 70 years. It meant that while the United States and the Soviets fought in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Angola, the leadership in Washington and Moscow remained off limits. What happened to Maduro shattered that illusion of safety. And to Putin, who sees himself as the ultimate guarantor of Russian sovereignty, this represents a direct threat. If the United States has the capability, the intelligence reach, and the political will to extract a sitting president from his own capital, what stops them from attempting the same elsewhere? What stops them from trying it in Minsk, in Tehran, or in the darkest corners of Russian paranoia in Moscow itself? That is why the mention of nuclear deterrence is no accident. It is the final card on the table that guarantees immunity. Putin is reminding the world, and specifically reminding Donald Trump, that Russia is not Venezuela, that Russia possesses a shield that cannot be pierced by a raid. But by invoking that shield, by dragging nuclear rhetoric out of the shadows and into public view, Putin has raised the stakes for everyone. He has transformed what could have remained a regional success for American policy into a global standoff. And he has done it by personalizing the conflict around Trump. Why Trump? Why not the existing bureaucracy? Because Putin calculates that the traditional establishment is slow and predictable. They play by the old rule book. But Trump rewrote the book. Trump ordered the strike on Soleimani. Trump threatened fire and fury. Trump walked away from the Iran deal. To the Russians, Trump represents the Wild West of geopolitics, a leader who might not blink. That unpredictability is terrifying for a system built on calculated stability. If the Maduro raid becomes the blueprint for future American foreign policy, then Russia is facing a fundamentally different United States, an America that does not merely contain its enemies, but removes them. That is why the warning was so specific. Putin is attempting to draw a red line immediately to define the boundaries of the future relationship while the dust is still settling in Caracas. The silence from the current White House is also telling. It is not standard, and it is not accidental. One official after another has avoided engaging with Putin's specific rhetoric about Trump. They have described the operation as a success for democracy and a victory for the Venezuelan people, but they have refused to address the radioactive issue of nuclear threats. Leaders believe this operation would be a clean win. But wins are never clean when the other side feels cornered. and Russia feels cornered. In fact, Russia's response ranks among the most aggressive rhetorical moves in recent memory. Almost immediately, Russian military channels began broadcasting reminders of their strategic capabilities. These were not routine drills. They were pointed messages about response times, automated systems, and readiness. Messages designed to be heard by the Pentagon and by Mar-a-Lago. This is the language of the brink, spoken because the old language of diplomacy has failed. What complicates this further is the reaction of other nations. China is watching, Iran is watching, North Korea is watching. If leadership removal becomes a precedent, authoritarian regimes everywhere will tighten their grip. They will purge inner circles, they will accelerate weapons programs, they will sever ties with the West. Because when engagement leads to vulnerability, isolation becomes the only form of safety. This points toward a fragmentation of the global order, a world retreating behind walls of steel and suspicion as trust evaporates. And this is where Trump's role becomes unavoidable. He is the variable no one can solve. His supporters see the raid as strength and restored dominance. His critics see it as reckless escalation. But to Putin, public opinion inside the United States does not matter. What matters is what Trump does next. And Putin is betting that a direct threat involving the ultimate weapon is the only way to force Trump to pause. It is a high-stakes game of chicken played with the fate of nations. Tonight, insiders in Washington say intelligence agencies are working overtime to assess whether Russia's words are merely bluster or whether there is an actual shift in force posture. Are submarines moving? Is the strategic rocket force on a higher alert level? These are the questions keeping generals awake at night, because rhetoric is one thing and movement is another. And when a leader like Putin begins to feel that his personal survival is inseparable from the survival of the state, the line between rhetoric and action starts to blur. We also have to look at the domestic pressure building around Trump. He is now in a position where he cannot afford to look weak. If he backs down in the face of Putin's threats, he risks losing his central appeal as a strongman figure. If he escalates, he risks triggering a conflict that no one actually wants. He is juggling these political realities while the entire world watches, and when leaders face that kind of squeeze, decisions often come from reaction rather than strategy. From the need to project power rather than from a plan to secure peace. The same pressure applies on the other side. Putin has his own hardliners to satisfy. He cannot allow Russia to appear as a passive observer while the United States reshapes the political map of Latin America. He has to show that Russia remains a superpower, a player capable of dictating terms. Both men are trapped by their own images. Both have told their supporters they will not yield, and when two leaders lock themselves into that posture, finding middle ground becomes almost impossible. The official statements coming out of Moscow tonight were designed to send a very clear message. Russia will not accept a unipolar world where the United States acts as judge, jury, and executioner. Russian officials stated openly that this operation violates international law. That phrase is diplomatic code for something much harsher. We do not recognize your authority. You do not hear that kind of specific, targeted anger unless the stakes are existential. And tonight, the stakes are existential. The entire foundation of international relations, built on the idea of sovereignty and immunity for heads of state, is starting to crack. And cracks in that foundation do not repair themselves. They expand. What we are witnessing now is a showdown of determination. Putin wants to know whether America will adjust its tactics or push even harder. Washington wants to prove it can act freely in its own hemisphere without asking permission. Trump wants to show that he alone can handle Putin, and the rest of the world is holding its breath. Each side believes it has the stronger position. Each side believes the other will blink first. And each side may be dangerously wrong. Reports from diplomatic channels tonight indicate that back-channel talks are nearly frozen. Trust has evaporated. The direct lines that normally manage these crises are either silent or filled with accusations. And silence at this level does not mean calm. It means calculation. It means responses are being chosen carefully. Because tonight, everyone has realized something they previously refused to accept. The old era is over. The era where certain lines were never crossed has ended. We have entered a phase where everything feels negotiable, and the only real check on power is the threat of total destruction. We have to fully grasp the magnitude of what Russia is signaling here. When people hear phrases like nuclear alert or existential threat, they often think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of ships facing each other down in the Atlantic. But this moment is different. This crisis was triggered by a single, precise intelligence operation that succeeded too well. The United States demonstrated it could reach out and remove a regime that was assumed to be protected. And in doing so, it removed the psychological safety net for every other regime that stands in opposition to American interests. Now consider the position this places Donald Trump in. He has always presented himself as a deal maker, someone who can sit across the table from anyone, whether it is Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, or Xi Jinping, and find common ground. But deals require leverage, and they require a baseline sense of security. Putin's message is blunt. There is no deal if I am not safe. He is stripping away the possibility of negotiation unless Trump publicly disavows the tactic that just removed Maduro. It is a strategic trap. If Trump agrees, he looks like he is bowing to Russian pressure. If he refuses, he reinforces Putin's paranoia and accelerates the arms race. And timing matters here. This is not unfolding in isolation. The global economy is fragile. Energy markets are already volatile. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. By removing Maduro, the United States has kicked over a hornet's nest in the global energy system. Russia, heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues, does not see this only as a military threat. It sees it as an economic one. If the United States gains control over Venezuelan oil flows, it could flood the market, drive prices down, and cripple the Russian economy without firing a single shot. So when Putin threatens Trump, he is not only protecting physical security, he is protecting the Russian treasury, the ruble, and the entire economic engine that keeps his government functioning. This introduces a layer of complexity that goes far beyond conventional military strategy. This is hybrid warfare, where economic survival intersects with nuclear signaling. And Trump, with his business background and focus on American energy dominance, understands this dynamic clearly. He knows this is not just about a raid. It is about who controls energy flows for the next decade. And he knows Putin understands that as well. That mutual awareness is exactly why the tension is so intense and the rhetoric so sharp. Both men recognize that the board has been reset. There is also the intelligence dimension to consider. How did the United States pull this off? How did they get to Maduro? That question is now haunting the Kremlin. Was there a leak, a betrayal within the inner circle, a failure of Russian intelligence to protect an ally? These questions breed suspicion and paranoia, and a paranoid nuclear power is one of the most dangerous forces on Earth. Putin is almost certainly tightening his internal circle as we speak, searching for the weak link, and as that circle shrinks, the advice he receives becomes more insular, more hawkish, and more detached from reality. That increases the risk of miscalculation. It increases the chance that Russia could interpret a routine U.S. naval movement or a standard NATO exercise as the opening move of an attack. Donald Trump is now the focal point of all this anxiety. To the Russians, he is the architect of this new, aggressive American posture, whether he is currently in the Oval Office or preparing to return to it. They are projecting all their fears onto him, and in doing so, they are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating Trump as an existential threat, they force him to act like one. They push him to increase military spending. They push him to strengthen alliances Russia openly dislikes. They push him to take a harder line than he might have originally planned. This situation is still unfolding. The coming days will reveal whether this moment cools down or hardens into something far more permanent. But one thing is already clear. The rules everyone believed were stable are being questioned again. And once that happens, the world does not simply return to normal. A psychological barrier has been breached. The idea has been planted. And ideas are far harder to eliminate than leaders. We are now witnessing a real-time stress test of the global order. Can the institutions built after World War II survive this level of strain? Can the United Nations mediate a conflict where one side no longer recognizes the rules and the other side has just broken them? Can nuclear deterrence still hold when the lines defining what constitutes an attack are being blurred? These are the questions that will shape the next presidency, the next decade, and potentially the future of human history. And we cannot ignore the domestic pressure inside Russia itself. Putin has sold his people a story of strength. He has told them Russia is a fortress, besieged by the West, but ultimately unbreakable. The fall of Maduro puts a visible crack in that narrative. It demonstrates that American reach is long, and that its memory does not fade quickly. If Russians begin to doubt their leader's ability to protect allies, they may begin to doubt his ability to protect them. Putin understands this deeply. He knows his legitimacy depends on the perception of invulnerability. That is why he cannot let this moment pass. That is why escalation becomes almost inevitable. He has to prove to his own people as much as to Trump that Russia is not next. So where does this leave us? We watch the submarines, we monitor the rhetoric, we track the back-channel communications, but above all we watch Donald Trump. Because in this high-stakes drama, he has been cast simultaneously as protagonist, antagonist, and wildcard. His next move will determine whether the temperature cools or whether the pot boils over. And for the first time in years, even the most seasoned experts admit they do not know what that move will be. We will continue following this story closely, tracking every update, every statement, and every shift as it develops. Because this is no longer just about Venezuela. It is about the future of global power. It is about whether the world moves toward a new détente or slips toward a new abyss. And right now, that future looks more uncertain than it has in a very long time. This is Union Journalism. Stay tuned.